incredible. I don't know who did it, if it was Evan, Ben, Matt, to put us on just after Kathy, because we love the idea of resilient democracies, and I think there's so much that we could say based on that talk. I would love to spend the first 5 minutes just answering some of those questions, but we are running out of time already. So the title of our talk is Funding DAOs with SuperPACs. Who knows what a SuperPAC is? Yeah, I think it's like a uniquely American thing. So I'll definitely explain it. You can just ignore it for now. Normally this is a video, so there's some nice animations, so I normally like to leave this up for a while, but there's none today, so I'm going to just move on. There we are. Who are we? So myself and Alex, who's sitting there in the front row, are the founders of Butter. As we said, we do DAO finance and governance. We've built a whole bunch of stuff as we've been kind of iterating in this space. And we ended up iterating towards something we think is pretty cool, so we're going to try and explain that today. We're at funding the commons. What does that mean? It means funding public goods. Public goods are non-excludable, non-rivalrous. We decided to try and take up the challenge of funding DAOs and public goods. Now, you could say that DAOs already have a bunch of funding, right? That's not really a problem. But I guess we're always looking for better ways to fund these types of organizations. And we've kind of taken this entire presentation and broken it down into a set of challenges. And what I'd invite you to do is just kind of think through each of these challenges as compounding on top of one another, try and get us to a solution. So with that in mind, we're going to start with the state of play. So we want to fund DAOs and public goods. A great place to start is, how do we fund public goods today? And maybe let's just ignore crypto for a while, let's ignore Web3, and let's think about what the state of play is. And we think about that in terms of who is the main organization or group of people funding public goods today. Governments, nation states. Lots of the public goods infrastructure that we all rely on is funded and developed, built and maintained by these organizations, and this was mentioned in the last talk as well. We know that sometimes these organizations fail, and fail quite spectacularly. This is a map of the world, if that wasn't obvious. We have a bunch of different nations, and obviously the dots are trying to approximate where the cities are, but over time, we've seen nations come and go and fail. And where I thought would be a great place to start was to really think about why they fail and what tends to create failure modes in nation states. There's a great book I read called Why Nations Fail. I forget the author's names right now, but the kind of overarching premise of the book is that nations tend to fail when one group within a set of people ends up getting all the power. And really, nations succeed, or they keep going, when there's a broad diffusion of governance rights or voting rights across a population. One of the things that's always credited with successful nations is a broad and inclusive spread of governance rights across a nation. That means everyone across society is represented, and we like to call this democracy. We also have this with property rights as well. If we give property rights to everybody, people tend to do well. And it's really, really important. And it's important, it's one of those things that, similar to crypto, when it's working, you kind of don't see it, but you only really notice it when it stops working. And I think loads of DAOs run in this model today, and loads of nations do as well. I saw an article recently about Haiti, and and the author was basically asking, at what point do we say that Haiti is a failed state? It's basically now effectively run by a very small group of people, to the point where pretty much nobody can pursue their own ambition or pursue their own aims. And this is, again, why nations tend to fail. The synthesis of the thesis there is that nations fail when one group is able to create extractive political institutions, which are then able to create extractive economic institutions. What does that mean? You're able to create things that are owned and controlled by one group and pull resources out from the rest of the group, and then you use economic institutions to do that. And you see this again and again and again, and this tends to always lead to a failure. This is Compound's governance leaderboard. As 10.68% of all votes are owned by one organization, Polychain. Then you have Bain, you have Andreessen, you have kind of the same companies. These companies are incredible, by the way. They're funding so much of the development in the space. This is not a talk saying that these guys are the bad guys, just that we are creating systems where the main goal of these organizations is to extract revenue, right? Extractive political institutions, and they do that really by capturing these extractive or creating extractive economic institutions. So we have a small group of wealthy organizations. This group is effectively building this model. We're building this model in crypto today. This is Ethereum. As you can see from I think that's when it was actually launched, you can see that there's a slow concentration of ownership into the top 1% of addresses. I think it's basically ticked up the entire time. It looked like it went down in like 2021, but really it's just ticked up the whole time. And the way I like to think about this is, as an organization grows and it needs to actually fund itself, it needs to actually sell more of its resources. And if its resources are tokens, then actually it's more likely to sell larger and larger resources to a smaller and smaller pool of people who can afford it. And so we tend to see this in most tokens. This is Lido, does the same thing. I could have made this deck way longer by adding more and more slides like this, but it kind of looks the same like for most of these. And it makes sense, right? This is what corporations look like. And so we just see this over and over again. So, DAO governance tokens, ETH and BTC. BTC has the same concentration, but you have to just pay more on Glassnode to get that, and I wasn't willing to do that. Over 90% of the voting power, of the tokens, are held by 1% of the addresses. But ETH and BTC do not have voting rights. I think it's underappreciated how important this is. ETH and BTC are the two largest blockchain networks in existence, and their tokens do not have voting rights. Not explicitly, they don't have voting rights, but DAO governance tokens do. I would like to suggest that has something to do with their success, but also if you kind of read anything that Vitalik's written, he's very against token voting systems, and I think for good reason. Plutocracy, we've spoken about this before, like this is just governance by the wealthy. And again, you could say that corporations have this intrinsic value, they are governed by the wealthy. But to the point from the last talk, I think if you think about a blockchain system is scoped. Like if you think about Ethereum, it's scoped. You can obviously vote in any way you want, but within the confines of Ethereum. You can't vote on Ethereum to change, like the weather patterns in Eastern Africa. Like, it's obviously scoped to something very specific, which is a really nice property in crypto networks. But here we kind of end up having these systems that end up being plutocratic. So what does that mean? Like, lots of people will say, like, Vaughan, it doesn't matter if you have plutocratic systems, especially as it relates to public goods. I would disagree. So here we have two examples of plutarchic open source software. Open source software is an example of a public good. It is non-excludable. It is non-rivalrous. Anybody can go and use the code tomorrow. No one can stop me. And if I use it, it doesn't stop anybody else from using it. Google is the main perpetrator here. They have a significant amount of cash, and they use it to wield public goods to destroy their competition. The first example is Kubernetes. AWS was obviously building a huge business, providing software for developers that they could just use as a service. Google said, I would love some of that. I'm going to try and get entry into that market. It built Kubernetes. Kubernetes is open source containerization software. Containerization it's a way of basically running applications. I'm just explaining for everybody in the audience. It's a way of running applications in a kind of a generic way, so you can run anything on top of any kind of hardware. And Google decided to build Kubernetes and deploy it as open source, so anybody can use it. This is a direct competition to AWS's business, and you could say that's great. Really, it was great for the ecosystem. Everybody loved it. That's incredible. But the strategy is that you destroy someone's business over here by reducing the cost to do some service. You compete them out of the market. Meanwhile, you build an entirely new moat over here, which is exactly what Google did. And Google have successfully forced their way into the cloud business, and obviously Google Cloud is now one of the biggest alongside AWS and Azure. The other time that they did this was with Android. Most people think that Android is a direct competitor to iOS, which it is, and it only has that position because Google, pre-iOS, decided to buy Android, which is an open source platform, and use it to keep Windows out of the mobile market, which they did very successfully. We do not use Windows phones now. Windows never had a chance in mobile. So yes, open source software can be used if it's captured by the elites, it's captured by the wealthy. It can be used to devastating effect. Before I kind of move on to like really what we're working on, I thought it was also worth just touching on the corporate side of governance. Like corporate governance obviously is a thing, and corporate governance is where lots of the lessons that we're kind of perpetrating or rebuilding in crypto have come from. This is Apple's list of largest shareholders. They don't have an Ether scan, so I'm using finance.yahoo. And this is the list of top holders. You see Vanguard there have 8%, BlackRock, Berkshire Hathaway, State Street. You see Morgan Stanley's in there, Bank of America. What's funny is when I looked at this, I was like, oh, this is great. I can just like change a few words on my slide and say, a small group of wealthy organizations hold the power to determine most votes in many of the largest corporations rather than DAOs. And then I went and did Amazon, and it was like the exact same group. So it's Vanguard, it's BlackRock, State Street, which is incredible, actually. It was quite surprising to me. But this is probably how most of our like big public corporations look, and the idea of going public as an organization is you get to some point where you believe that this organization now determines so much of the value flow in an economy that the public should own it. And so it starts to touch on some of the same principles that we're trying to build in crypto. I thought it was interesting. But again, that's just like parking that first issue. So the challenge is we want to fund DAOs and public goods. We've seen that there are models to do that, and we have governance tokens that allow us to fund DAOs and public goods. So the challenge too, the second challenge is we want to actually do this we want this mechanism to work, right? We're funding DAOs and public goods, but we recognize the risk of plutocracy. So can we fund DAOs and public goods without increasing, pretty much linearly, the risk of plutocracy? And as we saw, it's not necessarily completely linear. Yes, I think we can do this. So I'm going to now talk about some funding mechanisms. And by the way, because we've explained this to a few people, and sometimes people say it's quite confusing, so I'm going to use multiple examples along the way, and hopefully it does help you to build a picture. And obviously we'll have questions at the end. So should exchanges vote? And I'm giving you this just like a frame of reference. And the model I'm going to give you here, I want you to just retain it in your head as we go through, because it's really important. So this is the distribution of ownership of Sushi. And the black quadrant is Binance. Binance is a centralized exchange. They do not technically own any of the tokens, but they are stored there. So they're like my tokens. I don't use Binance, but they're like my tokens or your tokens. Oh, my tokens or your tokens. And what's interesting is those are governance rights. There's 8% of the entire voting population of Sushi is sitting in an exchange. And I think there's two really interesting things here. One is what's stopping Binance from voting. I think there's some normative ideas there about why they don't vote. But this is true of Coinbase, of FTX, of Huobi, of OKNet, all of them. They are holding some percentage of the total votes. And they don't vote because people just think it would be weird if they voted. But let's say that someone put through a proposal in Sushi tomorrow which said we should delist from Binance. Binance can do the calculation. They can see exactly how much revenue they would lose, and they could vote no. They could considering that most votes tend to have about 20% of the total tokens, they could just basically just nullify that proposal every single time. So this is what I mean. There's a discretion that we're just kind of relying on. And again, we love these models today, but we haven't seen them operating in failure mode. They aren't necessarily very resilient. So something to bear in mind. The second thing is I just want to now talk technically about the pattern here, which is if we use anything in crypto where we deposit our tokens into a contract, the owner of that contract inherits the properties of the token. So Binance has the governance rights purely because people have deposited tokens in their contracts, right? So tokens in a contract, owner is now able to vote. And that's important for what we're going to talk about later. So now I'm going to build up the model. So we're starting with our player one. I like to think about this in games. I don't know if anybody's read Infinite and Finite Games. I think it's a great book. But this idea of a player, this player in the game is a DAO. So DAOs produce public goods. DAOs also have a treasury, and they need to continually fund their operations. So we obviously want to increase funding for DAOs. DAOs obviously, as they get larger, they only have a small pool of people that can fund them. They tend to be wealthy. They tend to be the elites. So we have our first player in our mechanism, the DAO. The second is what we're calling a liquidity provider, but just think about this as someone who wants to vote or buy tokens. They tend to be small. If they were to go buy tokens in the market and try and vote in a DAO, they would be so small as to be rendered useless. A great example of this is the recent sushi head chef vote. And if anybody saw that, that was a vote which had, I think, 300 votes on it. It was to put in basically a new CEO of sushi. The vote was swung in the last day by 2 votes that came in at the last minute. One vote came from an existing holder. It was about $5 million worth of sushi. The other $5 million was purchased about 15 days before the vote. And it came out later on that was purchased by a new investor. So you can think about the actual attack there. It's someone who wants to be the new head chef, new CEO. You go, you find a new investor, you ask them to buy the tokens, you ask them to vote for you, you're the CEO. So just again, thinking about some of these attacks on DAO governance. But think about this person. They just have some tokens. They do want to vote. They do want exposure in the DAO, but they can't necessarily get it. And player 3, this is just the contract. This is just this kind of inert thing that sits in the middle, and it's going to help us as we kind of build out. So think about us being butter. We're building the funding contract. So in my other version of this was moving, and it was very distracting, so I'm glad it's not moving today. The idea here is that if you think about the side on the left, that represents these investors, these liquidity providers, people who want to buy tokens. If you think about the side on the right, that represents our DAO. Our DAO wants financing. And the mechanism is fairly simple. It starts with us, Butter, putting up a contract on Ethereum and saying, hey, we want to buy tokens. And let's say the DAO is sushi. We want to buy some sushi tokens. Then anybody who wants to get voting power in the DAO can say, well, I like Butter. I'm going to put some tokens into the contract. And once we build up enough, let's say we build up $2 million worth of stable coins, the DAO can then deposit governance tokens into the contract, take the liquidity out. They can go fund their operations. That's great. And then on the other side, we have the investor or the liquidity provider, and we just say to them, hey, well, we're going to keep these governance tokens in the contract, and we're going to mint some other tokens for you to hold on to. And they represent kind of your claim on whatever's in the contract. So, and again, this is the exact same pattern I mentioned before with Binance holding the tokens. We're just the owner of the contract. So now Butter have the governance rights in Sushi. We have funded the DAO. And what we love about this is we can start funding DAOs really just by amassing lots and lots and lots of governance rights and lots of liquidity for DAOs. The benefit for the DAO is we increase the amount of liquidity that's available for them, especially as they need to sell larger and larger chunks of governance tokens. And we've also improved the outcomes for the investors because they get exposure. Typically, we can buy in bulk, so we're buying in discounts. So we have some nice properties in this system. But again, all we've solved is our funding problem. But one of the benefits of that is we've created a model where we've separated voting rights and economic rights. On the one side, we now have the voting rights. We can have as many people fund the contract as possible without increasing the risk of centralization because we have the voting rights as Butter, as one organization, but we can keep adding more and more and more and more people on the side, so we can keep increasing economic rights. By decoupling them, it means you can scale funding infinitely. You can keep adding more and more liquidity to DAOs. You can keep funding DAOs. So we've kind of tackled our second challenge, which we think is great. And I just wanted to kind of explain that we kind of have something similar already in corporate governance, which is this idea of a preferred share. Common share typically has voting rights and also has dividends. You're getting paid out. A preferred share typically has no voting rights, and it has fixed dividends, so it has a similar properties. And corporations use this to finance types of projects that maybe they wouldn't fund with equity or normal shares. There are some challenges, and we'll kind of just keep compiling these and come back to them, but one of the really interesting parts is why would anybody do this when they could just go buy normal tokens? And we can come back to that at the end, and we're just going to keep adding to this. So the last challenge is, we've now got a model where we can fund DAOs and public goods by selling governance tokens. We can then separate the governance tokens from the economic rights, so that we can fund DAOs and public goods. We can do that without increasing the risk of plutocracy by separating economic rights from voting rights. And now we think we can get an even better outcome by doing the same, but increasing inclusion and plurality. And what I mean by that is that as we said at the very beginning, we want to create a world where there are loads and we have full representation of all people, ideologies, representatives, people who have like very different ideas from the people who are the elites or the people who have capital. And we want to make sure they're all represented within this governance structure. And so to do that, we need to increase inclusion. It's not enough just to have people who have money to be able to vote. So that's where the super PAC idea comes in. So to explain super PACs, in the US, they have an idea of a political action committee. It's just a group of people who get together to fund a candidate. They have some very specific interest, and they say, we want to fund candidate X, so they give them money. After a while, people said that that kind of campaign finance was potentially bad, so we should limit them. So they had a top limit. So PACs have a limit, I think it's like $10,000 that they can give to any candidate. Super PACs have no limit, but they have no limit in that they can't give the money directly to the candidate. So what they can do is they can spend on anything else. And sometimes this is used to some pretty devastating effects. But what it does allow people to do is allows people to they get to push their preferences into the market. They get to fund the candidate kind of indirectly, which is quite nice, as long as they're not giving the cash to the actual candidate. One of the ways that I've tried to explain this, which has helped some people, is to think about this in terms of music, which is the previous project that I built. We were tokenizing IP. And in the music industry, we've managed to get better outcomes in music, i.e. better music, because at one time in history, you had to be an incredible singer and an incredible songwriter to produce a good song. And then over time, we saw people specializing in both. We saw people who were great songwriters and people who are great singers. Most people think their favorite singers are writing their songs. They're absolutely not. There are some incredible songwriters behind them. I always think about Bowie, love Bowie, and this might insult some people. He doesn't have the best voice in the world, but he wrote some of the most incredible songs in the world. And you see lots of music from that time having the same property. So I think specialization tends to produce better outcomes. And the same idea here is if you think about DAOs and delegation, we obviously do this in our representative democracies. We have people that we pick to vote for us. They tell us their preferences, we vote them in. And this is a great property. Some DAOs have delegation. Delegation is important. Some have this model, some do not. But we think this is a really, really nice property, and we think that we could bring it to all DAOs just by having this model where we store governance tokens in a contract and then mint a separate token for the voters, so to speak. And what's nice about this is, before you just get whales and very uncoordinated groups of smaller voters, and then after that you get whales and you get these very coordinated groups who represent very specific interests. And a good example of this is, at the moment, you may have a whale who represents a significant amount of voting power, and they basically dominate all votes. In the future, what you're likely to see is people who represent groups maybe outside the DAO. Today, if you want to get some voting power in a DAO, you typically have to go into the DAO, buy the tokens, convince the people inside the DAO that you're a good voter, and you have to play by their rules. With this model, you can get outside interests who think that it's important to drive a DAO in a certain way, and a good example of that could be someone like Protocol Labs. It could be the network funding group, where it feels like it needs to have a specific set of influence around a set of ideas, and maybe they're building a contract to try and get those ideas funded. People believe in that. They fund Protocol Labs. Protocol Labs then gets all this voting power in the DAO, and that is great. It produces great outcomes, and I think it's a really good idea for building these pluralistic, integrated, inclusive systems of voting in DAOs and in crypto networks. So what are the challenges? So one of the things that we'll do in the workshop that we plan to later is talk about some of these challenges, but there are a few. I think one of the most problematic is the idea that if you have a system whereby someone can buy votes, effectively, that eventually ends up being captured by the wealthy anyway. And what you've seen in SuperPACs is this model. I think the original SuperPACs effectively functioned kind of like unions, but over time they've just ended up representing the people who own Chick-fil-A in the US, the people who represent the car manufacturers and so on. And this kind of capture is terrifying, and it can actually lead to very, very bad outcomes. So it's something we want to definitely work on. As a conclusion, again, our challenges were to, number one, fund DAOs and public goods. Number two, to do that while reducing or not increasing plutocracy. Number three, to do that while actually increasing inclusion and plurality. And we believe SuperPACs actually allow us to do that because it increases the amount of available funding for DAOs. Each funding contract offers deep instant liquidity, and it allows us to create markets that incentivizes new constituencies to form. And one thing I'd just like to add is, if you think about the role of Butter, we're the people putting that contract up, right? We're saying we should go fund and invest in this DAO. Imagine anybody could do that. Anybody with any ideas. As I said, Protocol Labs could do it. What we expect this will do is it will create markets in delegates, markets in candidates, markets in ideas that will continually push and improve and kind of using competition and markets to improve the outcomes we get from policies. So we think that it's actually a great way just to improve DAOs in general and to make our democracies or our crypto democracies much, much more resilient. So yeah, this is Butter, and this is the kind of idea of funding DAOs with SuperPACs. As I said before, we're running a workshop afterwards. And if you want to find out more about us, please go to our Twitter. It's @ButteryMoney. And there you can find our GitHub link, which links to the spec and implementation. As I said, I'm Vaughan, and I've got 4 minutes left, so any questions?
I really like your idea of splitting up sort of governance rights. It does seem to be an issue that things can turn into plutocracies, and it doesn't necessarily follow that you should get voting rights if you want a share of the profit. There was one thing, it's a slightly technical thing. I'd wonder if you'd heard about the regulations around collective investment schemes, because my understanding is one of the reasons why people give voting rights to DAOs is because it sidesteps the collective investment scheme regulation. It's just something you might want to look at, because people, they say, oh, we're doing it because we want everything to be democratic, but in fact, your collective investment scheme is heavily regulated, and if you're not, you don't have to bother with all that, and that's the real reason, a slightly dark reason why a lot of people set up investment schemes as DAOs. Because of the regulation issue. So yeah, just a tip, maybe look at it just to make sure you're clear on that one.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think anybody who's building in the space has to definitely spend time with their lawyer and include them in the design process. Yep. But I think the governance token model is also a direct result of regulation because it kind of diffuses the ownership and hopefully means there's no blame. Yep. But I think the model that we have, because it builds on top of a pattern we already see, which is that you have a contract with governance tokens, you mint a derivative token, and people just own the token. We're not actually implementing a separate investment scheme. So I think it should be like, yeah, I mean, not a lawyer. Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So on the blockchain, when there is like a vote on a proposal, like everybody can see if it passes or not. Mm-hmm. But if we're looking at the politics, as you've been suggesting, it's very important to what degree 76%, 33, 44. And people cannot see that immediately from the blockchain, so we need like analytics companies to tell us actually what the vote was, right?
Okay.
And all these analytical companies, they are using their own like centralized sort of infrastructure.
Okay.
Did you have any thoughts about that?
If
like,
the analytics company, so like Etherscan,
like
for instance.
Confusion around votes in the future.
I mean, I think that blockchains actually just solve this because you can always verify the information if it's from on-chain state. I think where you don't have that is like centralized companies like, say, Snapshot. So if they're actually just like storing the data off-chain, then potentially. But I don't necessarily see that as a problem just because it's supposed to be publicly verifiable and you're supposed to have a on-chain history. So I don't think that's a big problem in like voting in general in DAOs. Okay, thank you everybody. Appreciate the time.